So in this lesson, I want to share an important distinction about triggers and why some work and why some don't. And in order to do that, I'd like you to imagine two scenarios. So in the first scenario, you're driving down the road, and you pass a billboard, and the billboard says, go visit jamesclear.com. Okay, in the second scenario, you get an email, and the email says, hey, I really love this article on jamesclear.com, click here to read it. Now, in the first scenario, you're driving, so you can't actually do anything, right? You can't actually visit the website. So the idea that you could act on that trigger right away is false. And that's called a cold trigger, right? If a trigger it's something that tries to prompt a behavior, right? Remember, a trigger tries to activate or cue the habit that you're trying to build. But the distinction here is that it's trying to activate something that you can't act on in that moment. And so that's the difference between a hot trigger, which you can act on in the moment, and a cold trigger. So in our second scenario, when you get an email and it says click here to read the article, that's a hot trigger because you can act on it right away. And the distinction between hot triggers and cold triggers is actually a really important one, because often the motivation that we have or the willingness that we have to do a particular behavior, we only call on that when it's a cold trigger, right? We're laying in bed and we think about, oh, I really need to be motivated to work out the next morning. Well, that is a trigger to do that behavior right then, right? You're cued to want to do it. But the problem is that you're being cued to do that behavior at a time when you can't act on it. And then it gets to be the next morning and you're thinking about getting ready for work, or you're thinking about all the other emergencies and urgencies that pop up throughout your normal day. And so the key is to make sure that the cues that we have, the triggers that we have for our behaviors, are hot triggers that can be acted upon in a given moment. One interesting thing about hot triggers and cold triggers is that our smartphones are trying to bring, or starting to bring, many more hot triggers into our lives for things that we don't actively select for ourselves. So more than ever before, we're being prompted through push notifications on our phone, email newsletters that we get, social media updates, like that little red circle that'll pop up on Facebook that tells you have a certain number of notifications or messages. All of these things are triggers that you click on, and they're all hot triggers that interrupt your day and interrupt your focus and pull you into a different type of activity. And so the key here is that for bad habits, for habits that are time wasters or ineffective or distractions or interruptions, we need to be cognizant of the hot triggers that those apps and those applications are pushing on us, and then adjust so that we can either turn off push notifications, hide our phone in another room while we're working, block social media websites. There are a variety of different actions we can take, but the idea is if you can cut the trigger off, then you basically cut bad habits off at the source rather than letting them kind of infiltrate your life. Meanwhile, for good habits, there are often cold triggers that we have, things that we remember that we need to do, and what we need to be able to do is translate those cold triggers into a hot trigger that you can act upon in the moment. So remember the 3 A's that we covered earlier. A behavior needs to be appealing, you want to do it. It needs to be achievable, you can actually do it. And it needs to be activated, you're prompted and cued and triggered to do it. And the key with hot triggers is that it's activating things while it's achievable.